Welcome to my channel. It is an absolute privilege to have you back with me tonight. Before we step into the deep, suffocating, and unforgiving shadows of tonight's mysteries, I need you to take a moment to prepare yourself. Go ahead and grab your favorite snacks, pour yourself a tall, fresh, cold drink, and find the absolute most comfortable position in your bed. Pull the heavy blanket all the way up to your chin. Let the muscles in your neck completely relax, listen closely to the steady sound of my voice, and let yourself drift off to a deep, dreamless sleep, if you can. If you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in a story format, then you have found your permanent home, because that is exactly what we do here. Before we head into the wild, if you enjoy our content, please invite the like button over for a friendly game of hide and seek in the dense forest. Tell them you will cover your eyes and count to 100, but the absolute second they run into the thick brush to hide, simply get in your car, drive all the way back home, lock your doors, and completely cancel your phone service. Now, let us get into tonight's stories. There is a profound, primal fear associated with the deep wilderness. If you are listening to this and you are in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, you likely appreciate the quiet beauty of nature. You go to the national parks to escape the noise of the city, to breathe the crisp air, and to find a sense of peace. But what we often forget is that the forest does not care about us. It is completely indifferent to human life. When you step off the pavement and onto the dirt, you are entering a space where the normal laws of modern society no longer apply. Tonight, we are looking at 3 separate cases of people who walked into the American wilderness and encountered something that completely shattered the laws of logic, physics, and human survival. Our first journey takes us back over half a century, to the sprawling, ancient, and deeply mysterious Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The date was Saturday, June 14, 1969. The Martin family had a long-standing, beautiful tradition of visiting the Smokies every single year for Father's Day weekend. They were a tight-knit family. Bill Martin brought his father, Clyde, and his 2 young sons, Doug, who was 9 years old, and Dennis, who was just 6 days shy of his 7th birthday. Dennis was a deeply resilient, tough little boy. Despite being small for his age, he was fearless. He loved the outdoors, he loved climbing over rocks, and he wanted to be just as brave as his older brother. That afternoon, the family hiked up to a beautiful, grassy clearing known as Spence Field. It was a picturesque summer day. The adults spread out on the soft grass, sitting on a small hill to rest, talk, and enjoy the panoramic view of the mountains. Dennis, his brother Doug, and 2 other young boys they had met on the trail were running around the field, burning off their endless childhood energy. Just before 4:30 in the afternoon, the 4 boys huddled together in the tall grass. They started whispering and giggling. The adults, sitting just a short distance away, watched them with fond smiles. They knew exactly what the boys were doing. They were plotting a classic childhood prank. They were going to sneak into the brush, circle around behind the adults, and jump out to scare them. The boys scattered. Doug and the 2 other boys ran to the south, ducking into the tree line. Dennis, wanting to be independent and sneak up from a different angle, ran to the north and west, stepping into the bushes on the Tennessee side of the field. Bill Martin watched his youngest son step behind a bush. He chuckled, waiting for the inevitable surprise. A few moments later, Doug and the other 2 boys burst out of the brush behind the adults, screaming and laughing. Bill and the other grown-ups feigned shock, throwing their hands up and laughing along with them. But as the laughter died down, Bill looked around. "Where is Dennis?" he asked. Doug shrugged. Dennis had gone the other way. Bill stood up and looked toward the north side of the field. He expected to see the little boy in his bright red shirt popping out of the greenery, disappointed that he had missed the big scare. But the field was completely silent. Bill walked over to the exact bush where he had seen Dennis vanish just 3 to 5 minutes earlier. He called his son's name. Nothing but the sound of the wind. This is where the logic of this case completely breaks. Dennis Martin had been out of his father's sight for an absolute maximum of 5 minutes. In a highly dense, rugged forest, a 6-year-old boy simply cannot travel very far or very fast. If he had tripped and fallen, he would have cried out. If an animal had grabbed him, there would have been a scream, a struggle, and the violent rustling of branches. But there was absolute, terrifying silence. Panic instantly gripped the family. They frantically ran into the woods, screaming Dennis's name. Within hours, the park rangers were notified, and a massive search began. But the wilderness of the Smoky Mountains was about to prove just how cruel it could be. That evening, the sky turned bruised and black. A massive, violent thunderstorm broke over the mountains, dumping nearly 3 inches of freezing rain in a matter of hours. The rain washed away any potential footprints, destroyed any scent trails for the tracking dogs, and plunged the temperature down into the freezing 50s. Dennis was out there with nothing but a pair of shorts, a short-sleeved shirt, and low-cut Oxford shoes. The search for Dennis Martin became the largest in the history of the National Park Service. Hundreds of volunteers, park rangers, and even heavily armed Green Berets from the military scoured the mountainside. They formed human chains, walking shoulder to shoulder through the dense brush. They found absolutely nothing. Not a single thread of his bright red shirt. Not a shoelace. Not a trace of bone. It was as if the little boy had stepped behind that bush and simply fallen off the face of the earth. To this day, over 50 years later, the disappearance of Dennis Martin remains one of the most chilling, logic-defying mysteries in American history. How does a child vanish in the span of 3 minutes, with his father sitting right there, without making a single sound? If it is terrifying to imagine a child vanishing in the blink of an eye, what happens when the victim is not a small, vulnerable boy, but a hardened, heavily armed adult? Our second story takes us to the freezing, barren woods south of Brant Lake in upstate New York. The date was November 15, 2015. 82-year-old Thomas Messick was not a man who scared easily. He was a former paratrooper, a military veteran who had spent his entire life hunting in these exact woods. He was hunting with a group of 6 friends, all of whom were also seasoned, lifelong veterans of the outdoors. Now, if you are 82 years old, your body is simply not what it used to be. Thomas was tough, but he was fragile. He had a history of heart trouble, he was legally blind in one eye, he wore hearing aids, and he had just recently recovered from a severe, painful case of shingles. He could not walk far, and he certainly could not walk fast. Because of his physical limitations, the group decided to use a specific hunting tactic known as a drive. The plan was incredibly simple and incredibly safe. Thomas was placed on an old logging road. He was told to sit completely still on a stump. His friends would fan out in a wide circle and slowly walk through the brush, making noise to drive any deer directly toward Thomas, who would just have to sit there and wait. Thomas sat down. He had his heavy hunting rifle, his bright blaze-orange hunting gear, and a walkie-talkie clipped to his chest. His friends walked into the woods. They were never more than a couple of 100 yards away from him. Less than 2 hours later, the friends finished their drive and emerged back onto the logging road right where they had left Thomas. But the stump was empty. His friends called out his name, assuming he had just stepped behind a tree to relieve himself. There was no answer. They tried calling him on the walkie-talkie. Only static replied. They walked over to the spot where he had been sitting. There was no sign of a struggle. There was no blood. But most baffling of all, there was no rifle. Let us break down the absolute impossibility of this situation. Thomas Messick was an elderly man in poor health. The woods around that logging road were incredibly dense, filled with dry, dead leaves and brittle branches. It was physically impossible for a man of his age to walk through that brush without sounding like a freight train snapping twigs. Yet, his friends, who were seasoned hunters with excellent hearing, were just a few hundred yards away and heard absolutely nothing. Furthermore, if he had suffered a sudden medical emergency, like a heart attack or a stroke, he would have collapsed right there on the road. If he had become disoriented and wandered off, he would have left a trail of crushed leaves, and the tracking dogs would have found him within hours. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was brought in. Hundreds of searchers, elite canine units, and helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras combed the area. They searched the swamps, the ravines, and every square inch of that forest. They found nothing. Not a single piece of his bright orange clothing. Not his heavy metal rifle. Not his walkie-talkie. An 82-year-old man, with bad knees and poor vision, managed to vanish from a stationary position, completely silently, while completely surrounded by his friends. He left no footprints. He left no scent for the dogs. He evaporated. The case of Thomas Messick remains completely unsolved, a terrifying reminder that the woods can swallow a grown man just as easily as they can swallow a child. But sometimes, the horror of the wilderness is not that it takes you quickly. Sometimes, the absolute most terrifying thing the woods can do is trap you, disorient you, and force you to slowly realize that you are never, ever going home. Our final story takes us to the deep, tangled wilderness of western Maine, along the famous Appalachian Trail. It was the summer of 2013. Geraldine Largay, known to her friends and fellow hikers by her trail name, Inchworm, was a 66-year-old woman attempting to achieve her lifelong dream of hiking the entire Appalachian Trail. She had started her journey in April, hiking with a friend, while her devoted husband, George, drove along the route, meeting her at various road crossings to resupply her food and give her a warm place to sleep. Geraldine was a sweet, deeply loved woman, but she had a few significant vulnerabilities. She had an incredibly poor sense of direction. She did not know how to use a compass, and she was terrified of being alone in the dark. In late June, her hiking partner had to leave the trail due to a family emergency. Geraldine, determined to finish what she started, decided to press on alone. On the morning of the 22nd of July, Geraldine woke up at a wooden shelter on the trail. She packed her gear, took a photograph with a fellow hiker, and set off on the path. Sometime later that morning, Geraldine felt the call of nature. Following trail etiquette, she stepped off the main dirt path and walked into the dense, thick forest to find a private spot behind some trees to relieve herself. When she turned around to walk back to the trail, she realized everything looked exactly the same. If you have never been in a deep, ancient forest, you must understand how quickly the terrain becomes a funhouse mirror. Every tree looks identical. Every shadow looks like a path. You take 10 steps in the wrong direction, and suddenly, the trail you were just standing on is completely invisible. Panic began to set in. Geraldine pulled out her cell phone and typed a frantic text message to her husband, George. The message read, "In some trouble. Got off trail to go to BR. Now lost. Can you call the Appalachian Mountain Club to see if a trail maintainer can help me? somewhere north of Woods Road. She hit send. But there was no cellular service. The message failed. She began to wander. And in the wilderness, wandering when you are lost is the absolute worst thing you can do. Every step she took pushed her deeper and deeper into an impenetrable maze of pine trees and thick bogs. She eventually realized she could not find the trail. She found a small clearing on slightly higher ground, pitched her tent, and did exactly what survival experts tell you to do. She stayed in one place and waited for rescue. When Geraldine failed to meet her husband the next day, George panicked and called the authorities. A massive, multi-agency search operation was immediately launched. Helicopters chopped through the sky. Tracking dogs sniffed the dirt. Hundreds of volunteers scoured the woods. For days, Geraldine sat inside her tent. She could hear the helicopters flying directly overhead. But the canopy of the pine trees was so thick, the pilots could not see her bright tent. She tried to light fires, but the wood was too damp. As the days turned into weeks, Geraldine's reality became unimaginably dark. She rationed her small supply of food and water. And in the quiet, terrifying solitude of the forest, she pulled out her notebook and began to write. Her journal entries paint a picture of a woman slowly coming to terms with her own mortality. She documented the days. She wrote letters to her husband and her daughter. She maintained her camp meticulously, refusing to let the wild completely break her dignity. On the 6th of August, a full 15 days after she stepped off the trail, she wrote an entry that would eventually break the heart of the entire world. She wrote, "When you find my body, please call my husband George and my daughter Carrie. It will be the greatest kindness for them to know that I am dead and where you found me. No matter how many years from now." Geraldine survived in that tent for an astonishing 26 days before she finally succumbed to starvation and exposure. The most crushing, logically devastating part of her story was not discovered until 2 years later. In October of 2015, a forestry worker doing an environmental survey stumbled across a collapsed tent in the brush. Inside, they found Geraldine's remains, her perfectly preserved journal, and her unsent text messages. When the investigators mapped the coordinates of her final campsite, the reality of the situation was almost too much to bear. Geraldine had managed to survive for nearly a month, slowly fading away in the dark. Her campsite was located less than 2 miles from the main trail. It was only a 30-minute walk to salvation. She had been so close, yet the forest had hidden her so perfectly that search dogs had walked within 100 yards of her tent and completely missed her scent. 3 different people. 3 different forests. 3 completely broken realities. A little boy who vanished without a sound in 3 minutes. An elderly veteran who evaporated into thin air while surrounded by his friends. And a brave woman who survived for a month just 2 miles away from the people desperately looking for her. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is not your friend. It is a vast, ancient machine that does not negotiate, does not pity, and does not yield. Thank you for listening tonight. If you ever find yourself walking in the deep woods, and you feel the sudden urge to step off the path, don't. Stay in the light, hold your loved ones close, make sure your doors are locked tight against the dark, and let the heavy blanket pull you down. Sleep, if you can. Good night.